Good evening, everybody. I'm Peter Murray. I'm chairman of the Temple Bar Trust. And for those of you who haven't been to one of our talks before, I just remind you that the Temple Bar Trust has set up to bring Temple Bar back into civic use. The Westwall Company of Chartered Architects is looking to use the building as its home, but also we're setting up a program of talks and lectures and tours of the building, which will be dubbed the architectural gateway to the City of London. It'll be a place where people will start their walks and will be able to come to lectures like the one we're going to hear tonight, but hopefully in the not too distant future, they will be able to attend in the flesh. And the building work for Temple Bar, we hope to be able to start as soon as we come out of lockdown. And we hope that we will be ready to do all sorts of exciting things, certainly in next year, because of course Temple Bar was completed in 1672, which means that next year will be its 350th anniversary. And so we expect to be able to celebrate that in the building itself. But in the meantime, it's really great this evening to be able to welcome Margarette Lincoln, because of course her excellent book here, which is London and the 17th Century, covers the period that Temple Bar was being constructed and provides the sort of atmosphere that surrounded it at the time. London and the 17th Century, and I particularly like the subtitle, The Making of the World's Greatest City, and we have to continue reinforce the idea that we are still the world's greatest city, and that this is a great platform for it. I haven't managed to finish reading the book yet, but it's very atmospheric and really fascinating to read a lot of the sort of the detail of the times. And I really look forward to getting further on into the book when it covers the period when Wren was so active and the city changed so much after the Great Fire of London. So without more ado, I'm very pleased to hand now over to Margaret.
Well, thank you very much. I've recorded this talk, so I'll just wait for it to play. Thank you. This talk draws on the research for my latest book, London in the 17th Century. It's a people's history and looks at Londoners' experience of their own city. I do use the reigns of kings and queens to help structure the book and to make history more accessible, because I think most people use royal reigns to keep the chronology clear in their head. The 17th century was a famously turbulent period. Londoners experienced the trauma of modernization and expansion, religious division, epidemic disease, the disaster of the Great Fire, mass immigration, regime change several times over, and war. No pitched battles took place in London, but the civil wars, and later war with the Dutch, impacted heavily on London life. Londoners showed incredible resilience as their city changed almost beyond recognition, physically and in outlook. Shakespeare's London was not the same as Newton's. This evening, I'll be looking at the events and reversals that caused great stress, and I'll explore those factors which helped citizens to retain their sense of identity, giving meaning to life and work, despite unprecedented onslaughts. Let's begin by looking at a persistent cause of stress, London's rapid expansion and the overcrowding that followed. Here's London in the reign of Elizabeth I at the beginning of the century. London and Westminster were two separate cities, joined by the Strand, which was mostly lined by gardens, and the palatial mansions of the very rich, who reserved access to the river. And here's London at the end of the century, when its population had more than doubled to about 500,000. The maritime districts to the east had grown fourfold. The weaving district around Spitalfields had mushroomed. In the west, elegant squares for the rich offered a different world of privilege and some degree of hygiene. Social inequality was hardly new. From early on, London comprised quite diverse communities, including an annual influx of so-called foreigners or migrants from. People understood that overcrowding bred disease. Successive monarchs issued proclamations against new building in the city, a policy that only contributed to overcrowding in the suburbs. Charles I was the first English monarch to issue detailed building standards. He wanted to give his capital the same vistas that graced Antwerp, Rome, and Paris. And in his reign, Inigo Jones completed the Banqueting House, the Queen's House in Greenwich, and the Covent Garden development. But when Charles extended the ban on new building 2 miles beyond the city and included Westminster in the ban, people resorted to makeshift solutions to cope with population increase. Buildings were partitioned into tenements, cellars were dug, and stories added to houses, further overhanging narrow streets and obstructing light. Every kind of shed and outhouse was converted into a dwelling, and there was much infilling of yards and gardens. Crowded houses encouraged people into the streets, though until the 1680s a curfew sent people to their beds after nightfall. There was no street lighting. People out in the dark were usually up to no good. In the early part of the century, London was less than 2 miles wide and 1 mile deep. It could be crossed in under an hour by foot, but roads were so crowded it was often easier to go by river. Of course, citizens could escape to surrounding countryside at leisure, but conditions in the city often produced civil disorder. And a contributing factor was the large number of young single men in the city. Between 5 and 10% of teenaged males in England entered apprenticeships in London each year. The city had thousands of unruly apprentices who packed public demonstrations, taunted unpopular Catholic ambassadors, and rioted every Shrove Tuesday holiday. Filthy, narrow streets, many of them stinking with refuse from markets and animal slaughter, and the subdivided tenements in the rundown areas produced ideal conditions for contagious diseases. Today we remember the plague of 1665, but plague was endemic in London. In 1625, it killed over 35,000 people, about 1 in 7. As we've seen in our own time, epidemics hit the poor and the vulnerable hardest, and it was the same in 1665. Londoners did not face the plague as one. The rich fled the city. The king and the court did not return until 7 months later, so numerous tradesmen who supplied aristocrats with luxury goods simply went bankrupt. Many wealthy merchants fled to the western suburbs and didn't return afterwards. In this plague time, fear drove Londoners towards superstition and made them callous. Samuel Pepys would remark that dead people in the streets no longer turned any heads. He stayed in the city, trusting to his rabbit's foot and chewing tobacco. Fires in London were common. Close-packed wooden buildings were an obvious fire hazard, given that many people still cooked over an open grate. The Fire of London, a major disaster, started in the dead of night in a baker's shop in Pudding Lane, where the coal fire had not been raked out properly. A stiff easterly wind caused the flames to jump over streets. The chance to create fire breaks early was missed. The mayor, called out to give his view on the fire, hesitated to pull down houses that were leased without getting permission from owners. He went back to bed, famously declaring that a woman could piss it out. The fire raged for 4 days. Around 4/5 of the walled city was destroyed. Some 13,500 houses, 87 parish churches, 43 livery halls, and other important buildings like the Royal Exchange and the Custom House. The effect on ordinary citizens can be gauged by the description a judge gave in a letter to his brother. He wrote that he could hardly tell where parishes had been. For a population that strongly identified with their church and parish, this was shocking. And he continued, there is nothing but stones and rubbish, all exposed to the open air, so that you may see from one end of the city almost to the other, and you can compare London, were it not for the rubbish, to nothing more than an open field. Londoners promptly looked for scapegoats. They blamed the Dutch or the French for firing their city. Any foreigner was a target. The Catholics in particular had form, witness the gunpowder plot, and the fire had longer-term consequences. For example, the power of city livery companies waned. They now had far less money to give out as charity to their members, because all their funds were needed to rebuild their livery halls. Hot on the heels of the disastrous plague and Great Fire came defeats in the Second Anglo-Dutch trade wars. King Charles II and his brother James had deliberately started this war, circulating anti-Dutch propaganda and whipping up trade rivalries in the hope of increasing their royal authority and winning booty. Seafaring communities in the eastern districts of London suffered badly. First there were press gangs, then the return of the wounded, and government had no money to pay sailors. Once their wives could no longer get credit, families starved. London suffered the trauma of war several times this century. During the civil wars in the 1640s, loyalties were deeply split. Some took the king's side, and although most Londoners came to support Parliament, divisions took a long time to heal. After the king was beheaded, when Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector, large numbers of troops were garrisoned in London, so there were often violent clashes between soldiers and civilians. Westminster was especially militarised because of the need to protect Cromwell living in Whitehall most of the time. Soldiers in the streets were intermittently a problem right to the end of the century. Mass immigration was another cause of tension in London. Religious refugees streamed across the Channel from the 1680s. Protestants in France had faced renewed persecution from 1661 and experienced terrible pressure after Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which up till then had given them some protection. These refugees, called Huguenots, made their way to London, some with little more than the clothes they stood in. About 25,000 of them came to London before the end of the century, a dramatic influx, given that London's population was around 500,000. French refugees were objects of sympathy, but their welcome was mired by contradiction. Prejudice against foreigners was strong. Most livery companies made life difficult for them. The Huguenots were talented, hard-working, and undercut English trades. Samuel Pepys donated money to the charitable fund for Huguenots, but confided to his diary, "We do naturally all hate the French." At the same time, London's black population was also increasing due to commercial activity in the East Indies and England's growing involvement in the slave trade. And not everyone felt at ease in an increasingly cosmopolitan London. So I've outlined some of the pressures that Londoners had to bear thanks to rapid expansion, epidemics, the disastrous fire, war, and immigration. Regime change constituted another major disruption. It affected people's loyalties and sense of self, because to save their skins, they might have to change their religious worship as well as their political beliefs. First, Charles I was executed and Cromwell, a dissenter, seized power. Then monarchy was restored and Charles II crowned. Then his Catholic brother James was overturned in 1688 and the Protestant William and Mary invited to rule. Now all these power struggles were shot through with religious division. So I'll turn now to the factors that helped the authorities to manage the civilian population and avoid wholesale disorder, remembering, of course, that there was no police force in London. First, London had a stable tradition of democratic self-government and civic independence. The city was divided into 25 wards. Each sent one official to sit on the Court of Aldermen and several men to sit on the Court of Common Council, which had more than 200 members. All aldermen served for life and belonged to one of the city's livery companies. There was steady localism at parish level too. As in other English towns, officials such as churchwardens, overseers of the poor, and parish constables were elected to serve in rotation for a term of 1 or 2 years, as were lesser officials including beadles, night watchmen, and scavengers in charge of removing refuse from the streets. London's network of small parishes also helped to forge cohesion. When migrants joined these parishes, they found support. Social cohesion was also promoted by lavish civic displays and rituals. Funerals and coronations might be infrequent, but every year there was the Lord Mayor's show. This generally took place on the 29th of October, when the new mayor took his oath of office at Westminster. His livery company had to foot the enormous bill. Typically, the mayor travelled up the Thames in the morning, catching the incoming tide, escorted by representatives of the major livery companies in their splendid company barges. On return, the cavalcade came ashore at Paul's Stairs, joined a procession to the cathedral, and then paraded slowly up Cheapside. The show was a complete assault on the senses and served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the power and permanence of the livery companies, both to the monarch and to their own members. It helped to enforce discipline, legitimate social inequality, and underline the value of company apprenticeships. The procession, which generally included characters symbolizing London, together with music and speeches, transmitted city culture to successive generations and helped to create civic pride. For migrants, the pageant staged at key locations added layers of meaning to a city that was new to them, helping to bind newcomers into what was deemed to be the essential nation of London and the spirit of Londoners. The livery companies also held regular feasts, sometimes inviting the monarch, which again underlined their permanence and extended their influence. Royal funerals were another way of smoothing transitions that might otherwise provoke unrest. Queen Elizabeth's funeral, held in 1603, was lavish, presenting a sea of expensive black cloth designed to strike awe in spectators. Her funeral procession was a vital ritual needed to reinforce public order and obedience. It underlined the unwavering stability of the state and emphasized the network of power supporting the monarchy. Queen Mary's funeral at the end of the century was even more expensive, a display of grief that helped to cement William's grip on the throne. Now, this was an age when proclamations, often delivered from the pulpit, and processions were still the chief means that rulers used to communicate with their subjects. People set great store on the ritual procession of a new monarch through the city. It started at the Tower, moved along a time-hallowed route through Cheapside to St. Paul's, and then passed through Ludgate to Westminster. Charles I did not do this, thanks to the plague that was raging in 1625 when he came to the throne. His Catholic wife also refused to attend his coronation, another incomplete ceremony. And these botched rituals were remembered when his rule started to go wrong. Rituals are quite hard to introduce from scratch and do need to be high quality to be successful. The city employed the key playwrights of the day to script the Lord Mayor's show, and whenever the show fell into abeyance, as it did during the Civil Wars and after the Great Fire, when there were no streets to march down, it was a sure sign of weakening social structures. There were opportunities to build community spirit in times of stress. During the Civil Wars, Londoners came together in 1643 to build earthworks right around the extended city. In a wonderful euphemism, these defences were known as the lines of communication. Citizens threw a ring of over 20 small forts, joined by a rampart and ditch, right around London, north and south of the river, stretching 11 miles. Even women and children toiled with baskets and spades to build it. The ramparts were 3.35 metres high and 7 metres deep, and the ditches were 5.5 metres wide and 2 metres deep. The word mount in a street name today sometimes indicates where a fort stood. For example, there was one on the site of the Mount Pleasant Post Office building. 2 were built at the Elephant and Castle, and 1 where the Imperial War Museum now stands. There was a fort in Hyde Park. The remains can be seen today. This project helped to build solidarity and a common cause. But when the New Model Army under Fairfax and Cromwell marched into London in 1647, the capital was not permitted to have its own defences. The earthworks were destroyed. The action prepared the way for Cromwell's rule, backed up by military power. In this difficult period, coffee houses helped build identity and resilience. London's first coffee house opened in 1652 in the churchyard of St Michael Cornhill, in the heart of London's financial district. By the end of the decade, practically every street had one. For just 1 penny, customers of any rank could buy a dish of coffee and read the papers for free. Coffee houses benefited trade, insurance, and stock jobbing. They promoted scientific advance and the decline of witchcraft and superstition, because members of the Royal Society frequented coffee houses. There they discussed experiments and scientific instruments with the artisans who made them. And coffee houses promoted culture. Dramatists and poets held court in their favourite haunts. There was a dark side to coffee houses. Some said they inflamed political faction, although others argued that they provided a safety valve. The coffee house, they said, was no echo chamber that confirmed like-minded people in prejudicial views, but a forum for debate which moderated extreme opinions. And coffee houses did advance the concept of collective political opinion, informed now by print culture. When it came to regime change, ritual and iconography were always used to help enforce it and reconcile Londoners to a new order. Cromwell cultivated the persona of a plain, down-to-earth man who preferred to be painted, warts and all. But he still knew that he had to impress foreign ambassadors with palace artworks and expensive soft furnishings. And he kept Charles I's clothes stall, padded in rich velvet, for his own use. At Whitehall and at Hampton Court, Cromwell echoed royal ritual, and during his protectorate, court spending was at least as high as in the time of Charles I. Charles II, on his restoration, set great store by the order of the Knights of the Garter, with its uniform and ceremonies. He also touched for the King's Evil, or scrofula, as his grandfather had done, a public ceremony that his father had neglected. Charles physically touched almost 100,000 of his subjects, and this ritual helped to cement popular belief in his right to reign. Iconography was increasingly important. Even before Charles II was restored, Parliament ordered that the royal arms should replace those of the Commonwealth throughout the land. His restoration and marriage to Catherine of Braganza were commemorated in a range of products, from rings, thimbles and fork handles to earthenware flasks, jugs and wallpaper. The very first coronation mug was produced in his reign. When tragedy struck during the plague of 1665, ritual was still important. Excavations have shown that even as thousands died, corpses were mostly coffined, and that the coffins were stacked in neat rows up to 4 deep. People clung on to ritual, even in mass burials, although this image shows people being piled into pits without coffins. Iconic locations were of great importance in London. So, after the Gunpowder Plot, 4 of the conspirators were hanged, drawn and quartered in St. Paul's churchyard itself. St. Paul's was where Elizabeth had given thanks for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and it was a potent symbol of the Protestant faith. When Catholics were targeted, bonfires of Catholic books were made at St. Paul's Cross, an open-air pulpit in the grounds of the cathedral. Places of execution struck particular horror. There was a hierarchy. Traitors were beheaded on Tower Hill. Pirates hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping. Felons met their end at Tyburn Gallows or Newgate. Burnings took place in Smithfield. The execution of Charles I was deliberately staged outside the banqueting house because it tarnished that symbol of royal power, and afterwards heads were displayed on poles at London Bridge. After the fire, iconic buildings like the Royal Exchange and the Custom House were among the first to be rebuilt. The Exchange was completed in 1669. The new Custom House was in use by 1671. They showed that London was back in business. The monument to the fire, a symbol of civic pride and renewal, was finished in 1677. Statues had a role then as now. After the execution of Charles I, his statue at the Royal Exchange was removed and the pedestal defaced with the words "Exit Tyrannus." In March 1660, royalists who wanted the restoration arranged for a painter to mount a ladder and erase this inscription. Far from causing an outcry, people gathered near the Exchange and made a joyful bonfire to celebrate. It was a clear sign that they were ready to accept a new king. As you know, after the fire, Charles II insisted that Temple Bar be rebuilt in stone, although it wasn't damaged. The gate marked the boundary between the city and the court at Westminster. It was a visual marker of the city's independent power. The new design, built between 1669 and 1672, featured statues of Charles, his father and grandfather, and so upheld the continuity of Stuart rule. It also asserted royal control over a city that had opposed monarchy during the civil wars. The new design for Temple Bar incorporated a female figure, assumed to be Elizabeth I. This was exploited by those who were opposed to the Catholic James, Duke of York, ever succeeding to the throne. During the early 1680s, they organised Pope-burning processions on the 17th of November, the birthday of Protestant Elizabeth. At dusk, marchers wound past the Royal Exchange, along Cheapside, then up Ludgate Hill to Temple Bar. Men dressed as cardinals carried an effigy of the Pope stuffed with live cats, who shrieked horribly when the effigy was burned on a giant bonfire at Temple Bar. These were rituals of enormous excitement and passion, which helped to focus popular opinion and turn it into a political weapon. So ritual is a double-edged sword, and those in power do well to control it. But James did succeed his brother. In a deliberate display of continuity, he was proclaimed James II at Whitehall, Charing Cross and Temple Bar, using the same ritual as when his grandfather succeeded Elizabeth I. And as far as possible, the same ceremony was adhered to when William and Mary were crowned, although there had never been two monarchs at the same time before. And of course, James II was not dead, but had simply fled London. He had withdrawn, as people said at the time. His status was uncertain. Temple Bar played a role in helping to disambiguate matters when William and Mary were declared monarchs. As usual, when the procession reached Temple Bar, the herald knocked for admission to the city. On the other side, an officer for the mayor and aldermen asked who was there. "We are come to proclaim the Prince and Princess of Orange, King and Queen of England," was the reply. "Where is James II?" asked the officer. "He is dead. He is dead. He is dead," came the reply. And others in the group added that he had abdicated. The gate was opened. So to conclude then, when Temple Bar marks its 250th anniversary next year, I hope that its former role in stabling ritual will be duly commemorated. And here's a shameless plug. If you would like to order my book from Yale and can get in quick before the end of the month, you get 30% off by entering the code Y2138. Thank you very much.
We're live. So let me have a look in the chat, because I don't. If anyone has any questions, do please put them in the chat. But in the meantime, I've got a couple of questions, because those were wonderful images of Temple Bar that you have found, Margaret, and they were really good. I'm not sure we could ever quite recreate the Pope and cat burning, which sounds not sort of thing one could do. But I think declaring monarchs in at Temple Bar, we could do that in the future, couldn't we? So you know what the background I'm getting. We seem to be, there's a storm somewhere. Right. Can you hear me, Margaret, now?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Good, fine. Well, sorry about that interruption. So what was the what actually happened at Temple Bar when the monarch came? Do you know what happened in the ceremony? Because it's often thought that the monarch has to hand over their swords to the Lord Mayor when they go through, just to show that the Lord Mayor is actually in charge once they come in. Is that what happened? Do you know, or is that not something you're familiar with?
It depends whether they are announcing the new monarch, or whether the monarch is coming to perhaps dine in Guildhall, or whether he's doing his official march through the city on coming to the throne. But you're absolutely right. If he is doing an official visit, then he does hand over the sword to the Lord Mayor, who takes it, but then humbly hands it back to him. So it's a kind of sign that actually the city runs London and the monarch is based at Westminster. So Temple Bar was enormously important in terms of explaining that Londoners had their own freedoms. And that's why, of course, those who were anti-Catholic had all those Pope burning ceremonies, which culminated in Temple Bar, although it was very cruel to cats. And I'm sure you couldn't have similar ceremonies today. No, it would definitely be frowned upon.
And so you subtitled the book "The Making of the World's Greatest City." Do you think cities need to go through, because clearly it was a radical period? I mean, the whole place got burnt down, and also massive political change. Do cities need to go through that sort of catharsis in order to maybe rebuild themselves? Because clearly the way that the city was shaped afterwards did help deliver all sorts of aspects of it, first the East India Company, but also then...
It's very difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, the fact of the matter is that London was built on the back of money, and trade was enormously important. I mean, I've got 2 chapters in the book about the Port of London, because trade was quadrupling. And it was because all this money was coming in, I think, that London actually survived and became great. If it was on an economic downturn, you know, it would never have survived the plague and the fire. So no doubt it put citizens on their mettle, and those who did survive must have worked tremendously hard. I mean, London was rebuilt in 6 years. which is amazing, really. But if all the money wasn't flowing in, it would not have been possible. So I don't have this sort of sentimental view of a kind of London rising like a phoenix from these disasters and suddenly becoming great. An awful lot was down to immigration. I mean, the Huguenots made a huge difference in terms of production and culture and new trades, companies that could be sold on the stock market. Basically, a lot was down to immigration.
And I've only got I'm only on page 123 at the moment, but I've read quite a lot about the trained bands. Are the trained bands, did they then become the Honourable Artillery Company, or is that something totally different?
Well, there's a link. The Honourable Artillery Company is totally different, but the artillery company supplied the officers for this citizens' militia. So it was, they trained the militia. And so it was a sort of semi-professional body that could be called out in times of crisis. And of course, during the civil wars, they played a key part. You know, when Charles I marched on the city, the militia, the trained bands, went out to Turnham Green, and Charles I backed off. And essentially, he lost London, which was a huge mistake because London had all the money. And he never really recovered from that. So yes, I mean, there's not much architecture that can be seen in pre-fire architecture that can be seen in London now, of course, other than the medieval street plan that was used when the city was rebuilt. Ironically, you have to go to Greenwich to see iconic 17th century buildings like the Observatory and the Queen's House. And when it opens again in May, I think that would be the thing to do, to get a feel for the sort of huge advances in science and architecture that were made in that time.
Yes, well, you showed that rather wonderful drawing of a mosquito. Was it a mosquito or just a...
It's a flea, it's a flea.
A flea. Yes, I mean, it's fairly amazing that somebody could give such an accurate representation. And of course, Christopher Wren was really more scientist than architect, or at least a scientist first and architect second. So it was a period of huge investigation, wasn't it, into the world and all that surrounds us.
Exactly. A polymath is probably the right word for him.
Very good. Well, I think that we don't seem to be getting many people in the audience asking questions. Obviously, your very clear rendition of the history of the century gave everyone... Oh, really? Because well, I can't see them on my screen, so I don't know quite where they do. Okay.
The short answer is I don't know when the HAC was first given permission to march through the city with bayonets, but I really don't know. But it's one of those, it's an example of how independent London was, you know, that it could have rituals like this. I'll look it up, though. It sounds very interesting. Oh, that's it's a very good question to ask me what I was sorry to leave out of the book. Yes, that's tricky. I think that what some have said is that I have not given enough time or space to religious history. And I think that that's a fair point. But today we're not so au fait with all the different kinds of sects that existed at the time. And although some of them are very amusing, you know, not just the Levellers, but the Muggletonians and a myriad of other sects,
I left them out because I thought that it would make the book drier than it need be. But I think that actually that religious history is just as fascinating.
Good. Paul, no more questions on your chat. No more questions on my chat. So anyway, it just leaves me to say thank you very much, Margaret, for a fascinating talk. And it's really good to hear it just set the scene very much for Temple Bar and all the things we're going to do it in the future. So it's been great hearing, and thank you for coming this evening, or being on screen this evening. And I encourage everyone to buy a copy of your book. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.